Is the 2020 M1 MacBook Air still the best consumer laptop that Apple sells 3 years later? Let's get into it. Now, if you haven't seen my 16-minute M1 MacBook Air review, I suggest that you go check that video out because in there I stated that the M1 MacBook Air is possibly the best computer I have ever owned. And I have a lot of experience to qualify that statement. My first Apple laptop was the iBook G4 in 2003. Since then, I've owned the original white plastic MacBook, the unibody MacBook Pro, a 2011 MacBook Air, a Retina 13-inch MacBook Pro, and right before this laptop, I had a 2020 13-inch Intel MacBook Pro. The beginning of the M1 system on a chip can be traced back to 2010 when Apple introduced the iPhone 4. Now, the iPhone 4, in my opinion, is the best looking iPhone Apple has ever made. And it included breakthrough new technology, everything from the stainless steel antenna design, the Retina display, the front-facing FaceTime camera. So all of that new technology was packed into this iPhone 4, and as I said, it was peak Apple design. One thing that may have been not noticed as much is the inclusion of the A4 system on a chip. Now, prior to Apple bringing everything in-house and using their own custom silicon, Apple had been dependent on Samsung to make the processors for the original iPhone, the iPhone 3G, and the iPhone 3GS. Throughout his career, Steve Jobs has always said that great software demands great hardware. And you can see that going back to the beginning of Apple with the Apple I, the Apple II, and even when he left the company to create Next Step. So it only made sense that Steve Jobs would announce that he would be bringing system-on-a-chip design in-house and letting Apple engineers dictate the future of the chip. So the A series of processors found in all of the iPhones had very clear design goals. They wanted maximum performance with as little power as possible to go into the chip to maximize battery life. And that is exactly what Apple is able to do. And in fact, if you look at the performance of the A series processors, they're still industry leading compared to anything that you can get from Samsung or Snapdragon or any of the other Android phones. You will always see that the A series of processors in the iPhone is almost always at the top of the charts. The groundwork for the M1 system on a chip can be traced back to the A14 processor in the iPhone 12. Instead of just taking the standard A14 and beefing it up a bit, Apple really went to the trouble of designing specialized functions directly into the processor. So for instance, if you look at this die shot, you'll notice that it has more increased L2 cache, more performance and more efficiency cores. It also has special features and functions such as the secure enclave, H.264 decode and encode, and that on its own is somewhat similar to the Afterburner card that is found in the current Mac Pro. Finally, it also incorporates the storage controller, the memory controller. It has a nice sweet fabric that connects the SSD to the rest of the chip. So Apple really went all out when they designed the M1 to say that we want to make the most powerful chip possible, but still consume as little energy that is absolutely needed. This explains why the M1 system on a chip is so groundbreaking, not just for Apple, but the entire computing industry. Never before have you been able to have a thin and light laptop like the MacBook Air, but still be able to get 16 hours of battery life. Now, when we contrast this to the M2 system on a chip that's found in the M2 MacBook Air, that's where things kind of fizzle out a bit. So the M2 chip is based on the A15 processor that went into the iPhone 13. And there haven't been that many architectural changes to the die of the M2. All they really did was swap out for faster memory from LPDDR4 to DDR5. They increased the base memory bandwidth from 67 gigabytes per second in the M1 versus 100 gigabytes per second in the M2. Now, when it comes down to thermal management and performance, that's when we're going to run into the issues comparing the M2 from the M1. So the M2 processor, as Apple claims, has 18% faster performance in single-core applications. Well, that does make sense because Apple increased the base clock from 3.2 gigahertz in the M1 to 3.5 gigahertz in the M2. So in order to get that 18% boost in single core performance, Apple had to put more power into the chip. As a result, the M2 processor is not as energy efficient as the M1. And the way that it comes off doing that is through heat. The M2 chip runs considerably hotter compared to the M1 chip. And as a result, if you run an M2 chip, especially in the M2 MacBook Air, you're going to start thermal throttling the chip. And a lot of this has already been covered on Max Tech's channel. So they went into a deep dive looking at the benchmarks, measuring temperatures and clock speeds. They went through the entire process. They said that the M2 chip runs hot, and therefore over time, over an extended load, it's going to downclock itself to keep the chip cool. So that is my biggest complaint about the M2 processor itself. It's not necessarily groundbreaking. It uses more energy and it gets hotter than the M1. Now, I don't want to just dump on the M2 MacBook Air because it's a lot of things that I really like. I don't mind the notch, but I also appreciate the 1080p webcam. I love MagSafe, and I'm really grateful that Apple brought that back. And finally, I love the skinniness of the chassis and just how sleek it looks. So if I had a choice between the M1 or the M2 chassis, I would definitely choose the body of the M2. With that being said, it is the internals of the M2 MacBook Air that really rub me the wrong way, as well as the pricing. So as we've all seen so far, the M1 MacBook Air, starting from Apple directly, is $1,000. To get the entry-level M2 MacBook Air with 8 gigabytes of RAM and 256 gigabytes of storage, that costs you $200 more straight from Apple, and that's going to run you $1,200. And as we've all seen, we heard about SSD gate, and Max Tech was very vocal about the speed of the solid-state drive inside of the M2 MacBook Air. And he further demonstrated that the slow speed of the SSD will hold you back and it will cost you performance compared to the M1. Because my M1 MacBook Air back there has a solid-state drive that's twice as fast as what you find in the M2. And another thing that has to be said is that 8 gigs of RAM is really not enough anymore. To start up and boot macOS Monterey, that requires at least 4 gigabytes of RAM. If you are notorious at multitasking and keeping tabs open in Chrome, you are easily going to exist that amount of remaining memory. So because of that, on the M2 Air, you're going to have to swap out to disk. And as I said, when you swap out to disk, you get a performance hit. So when it comes to the pricing, to mitigate or to offset either the lack of RAM or the slow SSD, you have to put in another $200 more to get a faster SSD inside of the M2 MacBook Air. So what are we looking at now? Well, we can get similar performance in a $1,000 laptop. And to meet that performance in the newer generation, you're going to be spending about $200 or $300 more just to get a fast enough SSD. So those are my biggest problems with the M2 MacBook Air. It's not the external design, it's the internal components and the way that they're architectured and just the way that Apple buys the flash memory chips that's really slowing down the potential of the M2 MacBook Air. I think the M2 MacBook Air is a great computer for most people. However, Apple made some design choices that really hold it back from being insanely great. And because of that, I'm going to say my M1 MacBook Air is the best computer I have ever owned. All right, that's about it. Peace.